so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Dance to the Music of Time read-along discussion. Today I'm going to be talking about August's book, which is The Kindly Ones. It's so interesting rereading this series 7 years on because my memory of them is really weird. I mean, I know I didn't have a great memory for books, but I kind of thought that it was better than this. I had in my head that this entire book was set in 1914, not just the very early bits. And I also had forgotten lots of things, though as I've said with a lot of the books in this series, I seem to remember things precisely before they happen. The Stourwater photography scene, for example, I remember so vividly. I just had forgotten it was in Anthony Powell. I think I thought it was in Evil in War, because kind of similar things take place in Evil in War books. It's a very kind of Evil in War-esque scene, in fact. And when General Connors tells Nick that he is going to be married again, I suddenly remembered who he was going to be married to, although I had forgotten before. So before I get into talking about some of the things I love about this and the characters and the themes, I'll quickly go through the plot. The first half of this book, as I said, takes place in 1914, before the First World War, and then jumps back forward in time again to Nick's life later. And it's quite interesting because we don't really see or hear about Nick's parents very much. We don't even know what Nick's father does, I don't think, until this book, but now we find out quite a lot more about them, and Nick tells us about his childhood, about his family, his parents, the servants who worked for them, and about various people their family encountered, such as the strange sort of spiritual, mystical Dr. Trelawney. General Connors and his wife, who we've met before, come to visit, and while there, one of the maids, Bilson, has a moment where she behaves sort of completely out of character, brought on by the upcoming marriage of one of the other servants who she is in love with, Alfred, and Bilson just walks into the drawing room completely naked and hands in her notice. And General Conyers takes care of her and sort of takes her back to her room and makes sure she's okay. And then as General and Mrs. Conyers are leaving, they run in not only to Uncle Giles, but also into Dr. Trelawney. And when Uncle Giles turns up, he informs them all of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which is one of the events that triggered the First World War. This ends the sort of first half of the book, and then we move back into the 1930s, the sort of present of the full timeline of the book, where Nick and Isabel, his wife, go to see Morland and his wife Matilda near Stourwater, where they are living. They go and have dinner with Sir Magnus, who Matilda, Morland's wife, used to be the mistress of. Peter Templar turns up. There is a strange scene after dinner where they all take photographs, and Peter Templar's wife is completely distraught by sort of Peter's flirting with Anne Stepney. And then in the next chapter we hear about Uncle Giles's death, and Nick goes down to a seaside hotel run by Alfred, the old butler from his childhood home. He tries to sort things out in the wake of Uncle Giles's death and runs into a few people he's met before, including Dr. Trelawney and bizarrely Bob Deport, who we haven't seen since the second book in the series we have heard about quite a lot because he was Jean Templar's husband. And then in the final chapter, war has begun, and it looks at Nick's sort of attempts to get into the military and sort of play his part in the war. He's on a reserved list but hasn't been sort of called up to be an officer, and he speaks to General Conyers and Wimmerpool to see if they can help him in any way. But eventually it is his wife's uncle, Head Jevons, usually a rather ineffectual man, who seems to be the person who is most likely to be able to help Nick get on in his efforts to be part of the war and to be an officer. And we also find out that Hugh Morland's marriage with Matilda has broken down. So that's the basic shape of this book. Quite a lot happens actually in this, so very interesting. Things I love about this book. So many things I love about the whole series. I love the way that time works. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as a theme because I do think like time is potentially the most important theme in this book. But there's a really interesting moment towards the end of the book where General Conyers is talking to Nick about how he ought to really go and talk to a young man, because it'll be a young man who can help him get into the military. And Nick suddenly realises that he's not a young man anymore, and he hasn't really realised that he wasn't young anymore, that he's no longer considered by the world to be a young man. And it's almost the first moment you too as a reader realise that he's not that young anymore. He's in his kind of mid-30s, I guess, at this point. I really love the way time is used in this book. I love the flashback to just before the First World War and the kind of impact that has to sort of write about that and look at that on the eve of the Second World War, which is the bulk of the book, and looking at how kind of history repeats itself and so on. It's very interesting. I'll talk about this a little bit more later. Another thing I love about this book, as I love about all of them, is the way characters crop up that we haven't seen for a while, often in unexpected places, and you never know quite who might crop up next. Tuffy ends up about to marry General Conyers, Gypsy Jones turns up, Bob Deport turns up, there's mention of Sonny Fairbrother, who we haven't seen since the very first book. I love the way that Anthony Powell structures the whole of this series and sort of weaves in and out different characters and plot lines and parts of Nick's life. I think it's really wonderful. Another thing I love about A Dance to the Music of Time throughout is the way that Anthony Powell sort of juxtaposes and puts together sort of domestic and political affairs. The fact that Bilson turning up naked in the drawing room to announce her resignation, which is obviously sort of suggested to be this massively important moment in Nick's childhood, like something he remembers much later, even though he wasn't even in the room. That happens on the same day that Archduke Franz Ferdinand is shot. This significant event within a small domestic circle and this significant event within world politics and the world stage, and the way that Anthony Powell uses these happening on the same day, but we don't realise until the very, very end of chapter 2 that it is the same day. We don't realise quite how close we are to the First World War through the rest of the first 2 chapters. It's really, really significant, and I think it's really, really, really well done. Another thing I love about this book, like so many, is how many sort of staggeringly brilliant, well done images are there. Bilson turning up in the drawing room naked is so well done and such a powerful moment. Similarly, the kind of photography of the 7 deadly sins at Stourwater, this place which has been suggested to be somewhere where rather unusual activities, especially unusual sexual activities, occur. Very, very powerful scene and creates these sort of really, really memorable images. Next I want to talk about a few of the significant characters in this book, and first I want to speak about Ted Jevons, although he isn't important sort of till the end of this book. But I do find it really interesting that it's Ted Jevons, not Wimmerpool, not General Conyers, who is the person who has a way to help Nick get involved in the military and become an officer. It's Ted Jevons who lots of people think is a bore, who is seen as a bit silly and ineffective, who lives partly in his wife's shadow and is a bit socially awkward and sometimes tries to sell people random stuff that he's being commissioned for. But actually, in a time of war, things slightly change, and it's not the men of action that Hugh and Nick discussed, like Wimmerpool or General Conyers, who are able to sort of further Nick's career in the military. It's Ted Jevons, who usually you wouldn't expect things of. And one of the things I find really, really interesting throughout the series is this idea of kind of perspective and the way Nick views people, and how although he is a writer, although he is someone who analyses people and looks at people a lot, although the book is full of his very analytical, interesting looks into people, he often misjudges people, or the particular vision we get of someone is not necessarily the whole truth, and that's something I find really, really interesting in terms of the way the book looks at perspective. I also want to talk about Wimmerpool again, because I think Wimmerpool is such an interesting character, and his evolution over the series is really interesting too. When we first saw him in book 1, he was a bit of a buffoon, bullied at school and looked down upon. And yet at this point he has become someone who is very respectable. He's sort of working with MI5 and has all of these massive state secrets. He is incredibly important in politics and the war, and he is a very significant man in comparison to Nick. When Wimmerpool is there at Stourwater, Nick notes how Templar is no longer even slightly embarrassed, as he was a few years before, to be on first name terms with Wimmerpool. He is now sort of fond of him and treats him completely like an equal, and there's never any suggestion that he might have once looked down upon Wimmerpool when he was in school. And we also see the sort of nastier side of Wimmerpool through characters like Bob Deport, who talk about how sort of badly dealt with he feels by Wimmerpool. Although of course Bob Deport is really not a very likeable character, so maybe that doesn't make us judge Wimmerpool quite so much as it would were the same words to be spoken about Wimmerpool from a more nice character's perspective. And yet despite Wimmerpool being this sort of powerful man who has made himself enemies and sort of got to the position where he is, he's still thrown into sort of huge panic by the sight of Gypsy Jones, and he's still nervous and awkward and embarrassed about the idea of seeing Lady Molly again when he hasn't seen her really since he broke off his engagement with Mildred Haycock. And so he wants Nick to be with him, because although when it comes to politics and war and work he feels so much above Nick, when it comes to sort of social life he feels that Nick could be of assistance to him. So we still see those kind of vulnerabilities within his character. Another person I want to talk about is Uncle Giles, and a bit about Uncle Giles' death. Uncle Giles is a really interesting character, and one who has been in focus from the very, very beginning. The book sort of begins with Uncle Giles in many ways, and I think it's quite significant that he dies at this point, just before the Second World War, because Uncle Giles is a man who belongs to the old world. There's that letter Nick reads from Queen Victoria to him. Uncle Giles is a man from the Victorian age, as, to be honest, were a lot of people on the eve of the Second World War. Like, we often think of the 20th century as so separate from the 19th, but actually, like, so many people lived across both. But choosing for Uncle Giles to die just on the eve of the Second World War, and especially having Nick sort of read that letter and reflect upon Uncle Giles's life, sort of suggests that this old age has sort of come to a close with Uncle Giles, and now it is the new age and war and a very different sense of life, and a suggestion that things will be not quite the same after the war. I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Trelawney, though not very much. I find him a really, really interesting character. Also, interesting point, Trelawney. That name, I remember Mel from Mel's Bookland Adventures suggesting in the earlier books that the character of Sillery was quite like Slughorn in Harry Potter, and wondering if perhaps J.K. Rowling had read A Dance Through Musical Time and slightly based Slughorn off Sillery. I wonder also if she'd read A Dance Through Musical Time and pinched the name Trelawney / used it as a kind of homage / reference to A Dance Through Musical Time and the kind of spiritualism and mysticism that's surrounding them, and the slightly odd things that Dr. Trelawney says. A bit like Professor Trelawney in Harry Potter, he always talks in kind of grand, wise-sounding phrases, even when they're sort of not relevant, or even when he's giving specific advice, he says it sort of very broadly, like you could write it as a proverb kind of thing. But he is a kind of interesting character, and it brings me on, I think, to talking about some of the interesting themes in this book, because I want to talk a little bit about the kind of division between materialism and spiritualism, or even potentially at other times between materialism, spiritualism and the arts. A really powerful scene in this book is when Dr. Trelawney and Bob DePort are having an argument about their sort of different views in life, and they seem to get on and have quite an interesting chat, although they clearly have such utterly different perspectives on the world. Dr. Trelawney's is all spiritual and Bob DePort's is all materialistic, and Nick stands there not really contributing, and his view is not quite either of them. He is not precisely materialistic, but nor is he like Dr. Trelawney. Instead, he occupies this kind of other, slightly separate literary world. But it's interesting too that despite not being what he would consider in general a man of action, he is really keen to be involved in the war and to play his part in that in some way. I think it's interesting to look at the way, in this book especially, that the kind of division between materialism and spiritualism is drawn. We have characters like Mrs. Erdley, and even to a certain extent Uncle Giles, who are very drawn to spiritualism, and then characters like Peter Templar and Bob DePort, and to a certain extent Sir Magnus Donners, who are much more materialistic. In Matilda's choice to leave Hugh Morland, you can see her sort of choosing the materialistic Sir Magnus Donners over the artistic Hugh Morland. But also you see that things are not quite so straightforward as that, because you also get someone like General Conyers, who on the one hand is very drawn to Dr. Trelawney's way of looking at things, but on the other hand is fairly rational and logical and a bit more materialistic about other things. He has a scientific mind, he likes putting things into boxes, he can deal with complicated situations, and he has done well for himself in life. It's just really, really interesting to look at the way that different ways of looking at the world are kind of explored and put against each other, which I suppose also leads me on to talking about sort of perspective and the way Nick not exactly misjudges things, but looks at things slightly differently. And I do think it's interesting how across the series Nick sort of discovers and rediscovers things about different characters, ways in which he may have interpreted them differently, or ways in which the information he had was not quite the full truth. For example, in this book, Nick learns from Bob DePort that at the same time that he was having a relationship with Jean Templar was also having a relationship with Jimmy Brent. And this astounds him, and it really sort of makes him reevaluate and have to sort of reinterpret his relationship with Jean, because he didn't have the full facts and many things he thought were not quite true. It also makes us as readers reevaluate the way Jean felt towards Nick. And similarly, we have the way his sort of perspective on different characters change. Wimmerpool is always sort of proved more powerful than Nick necessarily expects. Ted Jevons turns out to be more effective than other characters. General Conyers lets down the impression that he had of him. It's really interesting to see how Nick's sort of perspective and interpretation of characters change across the series. War is of course an incredibly important theme in this book and for the next few, and the way that Anthony Powell sort of blends the domestic and the political and sort of international affairs is something I really, really like about the series. It's very important too that Anthony Powell decides to look at Nick's childhood and the start of the First World War at this point on the eve of the Second World War, partly because it looks at sort of the way history repeats itself, and partly because it really brings sort of war and the coming of war really sharply into focus in this book. We know that the war is about to come, and by the end of the book it has started and life is changing. We also get this great sense of restlessness. Nick and Hugh, as artistic people, talk about the fact that they can't write music, they can't write books, because there's too much uncertainty in the world. So much stress and strain, people are having to move and uproot their lives and everything is changing, and we get the sense of difficult days to come and a real sort of changing in life. Nick talks about the fact that no one in wartime seems to have the same profession that they did in peacetime. Everything is going to change. Another theme I think is quite interesting to talk about in this book is mental health. In previous books, Nick Jenkins has commented on sort of dotty characters who are eccentric, don't behave in the way society expects them to, and we also have of course the suicide of McClintock at the end of the last book. In this book we also see several other characters who are struggling with certainly what we from a modern perspective would describe as mental health issues. We have Bracy, with his funny days where he is depressed and finds it hard to sort of go about and do things. We have Bilson and her sort of nervous breakdown when she turns up in the drawing room naked. And we have Peter Templar's wife, Betty, who cannot cope with life with Peter, who has become disassociated from life, who struggles very, very much to talk and who very much struggles with the way Templar leads his life and his unfaithfulness to her. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the theme of time, which, as I mentioned earlier, is pretty important in this series, A Dance the Musical Time. Would you be surprised? I love the idea of time as music, and I think the way people come back and then leave again and then come back sort of in and out of the spotlight in this book is very much like a dance, especially if you think of those kind of old-fashioned traditional dances where people sort of move around the room and you move different partners. Looking at the way characters recur in this series as people moving back and forth in a dance, and also as sort of motifs in music, I think is a really, really interesting way to look at it. So many characters constantly turn up from the past, characters we haven't thought of for a while. Gypsy Jones turns up, Mrs. Erdley, Bob DePort, Sonny Fairbrother is mentioned, but interestingly, it's not just the characters who turn up again and again, it's also kind of cycles and moments and events. The First World War and Second World War as a kind of cycle of time and music. Comparisons of Betty Templar and her sort of mini nervous breakdown at Starwater in comparison to Bilson's earlier at Stonehurst. The fact that Matilda at the end of the book goes back to Magnus, who she used to be the mistress of. The very dinner at Starwater has a lot of similarities to the one in A Buyer's Market. Except now, Wedderpool's social position and sort of power dynamic is very, very different. Things go round and round in a sort of glorious way, and it's one of the things I love about this series. The idea of time as music and this series as a kind of piece of music is a really interesting one. I think music as well is very interesting to use as a kind of extended metaphor, because music on the one hand feels like natural progression and is full of kind of interesting motifs, but also music is conducted and music is the playing through of a score that has been written. So there is this kind of sense of fate going through the books as well. And partly, I suppose, because everyone reading this book when it was published after the Second World War knows that at this point in the story the Second World War's got to occur. It's just a really, really interesting dynamic. So I think I've rambled on about this one for long enough. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know if you read the Kindly ones this month and if you enjoyed it, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.